to missing Rhodey and maybe not missing Rhodey.
Oh, does it have to do with the Tampa VA?
Oh,
It does.
here, Corey, this is for the description box. Just so you guys know, when you guys put stuff in the description box, it's there, later when people watch your video. But when people watch your video later,
We're live.
I know.
We're live now.
We're live now. I'm like rubbing my nose and doing a thing.
He does that.
I do this to Greg all the time, and it's funny when I do it to Greg.
I feel your pain.
Necessarily funny when I do it to other people.
Yep.
Yeah, like a girl.
Yeah, I suck. That's how that works.
Here we are. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to our live show, or whatever.
So, Ash,
I'm going to share this out before we get completely.
Yes, please. And
yes,
honestly, I think I want to. This is one of those ones where actually, you know what? I'm going to actually do this right now. I'm going to record this locally, because I want to make sure that we can kind of section this out as an actual piece of content later on. Obviously, hashtag coffee. If you've ever been here before, you realize that we're flying by the seat of our pants, and we have no intention of ever changing any of that at all. But this is sort of a momentous time, and Ash, was saying, obviously, she was thinking about reading out the letters from the letter from the Birmingham jail, and we were like, please come do that on our show, like right effing now. But it was 2 days ago, so that really wouldn't work. So now we're doing it right now. So Ash, maybe if you, just because I know there's a few people that will be joining in. Obviously, this is one of those mornings, guys. When you show up here, please share this out to Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. Because I personally, and I'm sure that most of us share this view. Like, this is the kind of conversation that I'm hoping is happening more all over the place, right? So we want to sort of get this out there. So while more people come in, Ash, what I mean, I was gonna ask what made you want to do this, but it's kind of obvious. I don't know, the world's falling apart. We're having a race war.
Yeah, I think maybe why this reading, why
Right.
this is important right now.
So the letter from Birmingham Jail it's one of my favorite King writings, basically, of anything that he ever did. And I grew up reading, listening. Obviously he was gone before I was born, but I grew up in a community and an environment that was radically diverse. Before we moved to Colorado, when I was about 11 years old, I grew up in Ohio, and we were surrounded by a very diverse community. And so the ideas, the stories around civil rights in Ohio and the Black Power movement and Dr. King, and these were constant topics of conversation that were near and dear to my heart. And as I got older and began to study more, when I read the letter from Birmingham Jail and began to understand King even more, it's a letter that I began to carry with me, whether it was a copy on my laptop, it's now a copy on my phone. He wrote, for those of you who subscribe to the Christian tradition, Dr. King wrote this in the format of one of Paul's letters. Paul was a man who is considered the greatest apostle of the Bible, and he was often arrested for spreading his faith, and he would write letters from prison to the churches at the time, to instruct them, to correct them, to encourage them, to give opportunity for them to learn more about this faith that they were all grappling with. The first church was constantly trying to decide what matters, what doesn't matter, what's the role of men, what's the role of women, how do we function under an oppressive Roman Empire? Because at this point, Rome was persecuting Christians. So he was writing these letters as a way to try and connect with people. He was an activist for Christianity at that point. And so when Dr. King ended up in jail, as he did many times after protests, he wrote this particular letter from Birmingham Jail in 1963. And it's a very spiritual letter, and it's addressed to white Christian people. And it's a letter that carries some of his most fierce words. We forget the ferocity of King as often as we forget the evolution and even tenderness of Malcolm X. When you look at these men, they seem like they're opposing sides. And as white people, we always grew up thinking Malcolm bad, King good. But
Right.
it's because we also patronized King into this peace-loving, easygoing, soft guy because that's what fit the white Christian narrative. And that's not entirely who he was. He was somebody who, he didn't advocate for violence, but he understood it, and he understood the fierceness and the passion and the desperation that was coming out of not only himself, but a people that were consistently having to fight government oppression, which is, we're here 50 years later, we're here. And there's still so much work to be done. So for me, this letter just feels personal. It's not just a letter from Birmingham Jail. It is the gospel of Dr. King, of the apostle Dr. King. And I consider him, maybe our modern day, sort of our the modern day apostle, the way a Christian might describe someone like Paul. And so to me, it was really important because Dr. King wrote this for white people. As a white person, in the spirit of like being a messenger, in the old days, you'd send a message and like the person who could read it would read out the message to everybody. And I kind of feel like I want to do that. And I know that this is going to address more white people, and that's who it should. And we need to listen to these words.
All right, well,
Perfect.
Yeah, let's.
I'm going to mute my mic and let you go here.
Yeah, 100%. Get after it.
Okay. The letter from Birmingham Jail, the 16th of April, 1963. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement, calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of a day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine good and goodwill, and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try and answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every Southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I'm here because I have organizational ties here. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the apostle Paul left his village of Sardis and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again Can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outside agitator idea? Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with the effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. They have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any other city in the nation. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. Then, last summer, came the opportunity to talk with the leaders of Birmingham's economic community. In the course of the negotiations, certain promises were made by the merchants, for example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. On the basis of these promises, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to the moratorium on all demonstrations. As the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs briefly removed returned, the others remained. As in so many past experiences, our hopes had been blasted and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? We decided to schedule our direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period of the year. Knowing that the strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt that this would be the best time to bring pressure to bear on the merchants for the needed change. Then it occurred to us that Birmingham's mayoral election was coming up in March, and we speedily decided to postpone action until after Election Day, when we discovered that the Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, had piled up enough votes to be in the runoff. We decided again to postpone action until the day after the runoff so that the demonstrations could not be used to cloud the issues. Like many others, we waited to see Mr. Connor defeated, and to this end, we endured postponement after postponement. Having aided in this community need, we felt our direct action program could be delayed no longer. You may well ask, what direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You're quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such tension that the community which has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to dramatize the issue, that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of a nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess, I'm not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there's a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we seek the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis packed that it will inevitably open the doors to negotiation. I therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down with tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue. One of the basic points in your statement is that the action that I and my associates have taken in Birmingham is untimely. Some have asked, why didn't you give the new city administration time to act? The only answer that I can give to this query is that the new Birmingham administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing one before it will act. We are sadly mistaken if we feel the election of Albert Boutwell as mayor will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While Mr. Boutwell is a much more gentle person than Mr. Connor, they're both segregationists, dedicated to the maintenance of the status quo. I have hope that Mr. Boutwell will be reasonable enough to see the futility of massive resistance to degradation, but he will not see this without pressure from devotees of civil rights. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. Lamentably, it is an historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture. But as Reynold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do people treat colored people so mean? when you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you're humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes the N-word, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us to consciously break laws. One may well ask, well, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus, it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right. And I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This difference is made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. This sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say that the legislator of Alabama, which set up the state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I've been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong with having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and deny citizens of the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you're able to see the distinction. I'm trying to point out, in no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with the willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that as an individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced subliminally in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on a ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believe that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than the absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exists for the purpose of establishing justice. And then when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that has never been cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unwavering commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that the federal courts have consistently affirmed it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. I had also hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. I've just received a letter from a white brother in Texas. He writes, all Christians know that colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but is it possible that you are in too great a religious hurry? It's taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. Such an attitude stems from the tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel, the people of ill will have used time more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not for merely hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God, and without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally to the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. You speak of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is the force of complacency, made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation. And in part, of a few middle-class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit from segregation, have become insensitive to the problem of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various Black national groups that are springing up across the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. Nourished by the Negroes' frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination, this movement, made up of people who have lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who've concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. I have tried to stand between these two forces, saying that we need to emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent nor the hatred and despair of the Black nationalist, for there is a more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that though the influence of the Negro church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged, by now many streets in the South would, I am convinced, would be flowing with blood. And I'm further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss us as rabble-rousers and outside agitators, those of us who employ nonviolent direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in Black nationalist ideologies, a development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself. And that is what happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained, consciously or unconsciously. He's been caught up by the Zeitgeist with his Black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers in Asia, South America, and the Caribbean. The United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations and must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact in history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into a creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them, which despitefully use you and persecute you? Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. He's quoting here. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Quote, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will say in jail, the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be the extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for preservation of injustice or the extension of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. I had hoped that the white moderate would see this need. Perhaps I was too optimistic. Perhaps I expected too much. I suppose I should have realized a few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans of the passionate yearnings of the oppressed. And still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by a strong, persistent, and determined action. I am grateful, however, that some of our white brothers in the South have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. They are still too few in quantity, but they are big in quality. Some, such as Ralph McGill, Lillian Smith, Harry Golden, James McBride Dabbs, and Braden, Sarah Patton Boyle, have written about our struggle in eloquent and prophetic terms. Others have marched with us, nameless, down the streets in the South. They have languished in filthy, roach-infested jails, suffering the abuse, brutality of policemen who viewed them as dirty and lovers. Unlike so many of their moderate brothers and sisters, they have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action. Anecdotes to combat the disease of segregation. Let me note my other major disappointment. I have so greatly been disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on the issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stand on this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your worship service on a non-segregated basis. I commend the Catholic leaders in this state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these noticeable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate, I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel who loves the church, who is nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. When I suddenly capitulated into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, rabbis in the South would be among our strongest supporters. Instead, some of them and outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the security of stained glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams, I came to Birmingham with the hope that white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause, and with deep moral concern would serve as the channel through which our just grievances would reach the power structure. I had hopes that each of you would understand, but again, I've been disappointed. I have heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshipers to comply with the desegregation decision because it is the law, but I have longed to hear white ministers declare, follow this decree because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother in the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro. I have watched white churches stand on the sideline and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities in the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice. I've heard many ministers say those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern. And I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion, which makes strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between sacred and the secular. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the southern states on sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings. I have looked at the South's beautiful churches and their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I've beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings over and over. I have found myself asking what kind of people worship here, who is their God, where were their voices when the lips of the governor dripped with words of interposition and nullification. Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? Yes, the questions are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is no deep love. Yes, I love the church. How could I not otherwise? I am in rather unique position of being the son and grandson and the great-grandson of preachers. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ, but oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through the social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists. There was a time when the church was very powerful. In the time when the early Christians rejected it being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated, but their efforts and example that they brought an end to such ancient evils is in infanticide and gladiatorial contests throughout the end of such. Let me read that again. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatory evils. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is the arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silence. And often even the vocal sanctions of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit loyalties of millions, and dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century, 21st century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too inextricably bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? Perhaps I must turn my faith to the inner spiritual church, the church within the church, as the true ecclesia and hope of the world. But again, I am thankful to God that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in the struggle for freedom. They have left their secure congregations and walked the streets of Albany with us. They have gone down the highways of the South on torturous rides of freedom. They have gone to jail with us. Some have been dismissed from their churches, have lost support of their bishops and fellow ministers, but they have acted in the faith that right defeated is stronger than evil triumph. Their witness has been the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel. In these troubled times, they have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge in this divisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham. Even if our motives are at present misunderstood, we will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation of America, all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of history, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king, they built homes. They built the homes of their masters while suffering gross injustice and shameful humiliation, and yet out of bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop in the inexpressible cruelties of slavery. Could not stop us. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we face now will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. Before closing, I feel impelled to mention one other point in your statement that has troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would have would have warmly commended the police force if you had seen its dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent Negroes. I doubt that you would so quickly commend the policemen if you were to observe their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes here in the city jail, if you were to watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you were to see them slap and kick old Negro men and young boys, if you were to observe them as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together, I cannot join you in your praise of Birmingham Police Department. It is true that the police have exercised a degree of discipline in handling demonstrators. In this sense, they have conducted themselves rather non-violently in public. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation? Over the past few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I've tried to make clear that this is wrong, to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or perhaps even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. Perhaps Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather nonviolent in public, as was Chief Pritchett in Albany, but they have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of racial injustice. T.S. Eliot has said, the last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. I wish you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of great provocation. One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Meredith with the noble sense of purpose that enables them to face jeering the jeering hostile mobs, and with agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of a pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in the 72-year-old woman in Montgomery who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided to ride segregated buses, and who responded with ungrammatical profundity to one who inquired about her weariness. My feet are tired, but my soul is at rest. They will be the young high school and college students, the young ministers of the gospel, and the host of their elders, courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willing to go to jail for conscience sake. One day, the South will know when these disinherited children of God of the American dream, disinherited children of the American dream, for the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, thereby bring our nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in their formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Never before have I written so long a letter. I am afraid it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk, but what else can one do when he's alone in a narrow jail other than write long letters and think long thoughts and pray long prayers? If I had said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstandings will be lifted in our fear-drenched communities, and in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine our great nation with all of their beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King Jr. It was a lot longer than I thought it was.
That's an incredibly difficult thing to read, and I commend you.
And there's definitely like names and words I sort of stumble over there, just things that are like there were sentences that we don't quite, even in writing, are sort of written differently because they're formal, and we don't necessarily write as formally as that anymore.
Right. That's absolutely correct. Boy, there were so many things in there that were encouraging and discouraging at the same, like by measure. Like, how much progress have we actually made? Right. White people went to sleep on this.
Yeah.
White people we told ourselves that this was over, that the South was desegregated, victory. Okay. And what, like this week in Birmingham, after a court fight of several years to take down Confederate monuments in city parks, the state attorney of the state of Mississippi has been fighting that in court. This week, violent protesters solved the problem, and in 2020 took down the Confederate monuments in Birmingham city parks. That he wrote this letter the year before I was born, and it took this long to rid ourselves of monuments to segregation and slavery. Absolutely incredible to me how little progress that we've made.
Well, and that is the interesting thing is that he had these hopes that there would be shift and change. He had these hopes that honestly that we're still fighting for, particularly as it concerns conditions of jails, as it concerns. I mean, President Trump talked about dogs, and he mentions, wouldn't you be sickened by the dogs? We now have a president that wants to sick the dogs.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that we cling to little hopeful things that we see in a way that our African-American brothers and sisters and people of color can't. Like, we think that churches now are it was something that gave me hope the other day was knowing that the clergy at St. John's Church was on the patio distributing water and food to protesters, interacting with them all day, offering love and support, and understanding their cause and fighting with them. And those clergy were tear gassed and smoke bombed and flashbanged off of that Porsche so that the president of the United States could walk across the street and hold up a Bible for a photo op. What gives me hope in that is that church is literally in the heart of the center of power of the entire free world. And they took that stand with the protesters, and they were punished for it. And I want to see that as hopeful, but I'm sure African Americans in the protest movement were like, yep, surprise. That's how far we've come. And that overwhelming sense of weariness that they feel hurts my heart.
It does. It really, really does, because they continue to have these conversations with their sons and daughters. I mean, he mentions different people talking to their kids. Those same conversations are happening. And I don't look at this and go, oh, such a sad disappointment. It is a sad disappointment, but at the same time, there's this element that the human condition, as long as the oppressor maintains some sort of control, it doesn't change. It continues on. They accomplished securing a vote, which, by the way, is being fought over again.
Right.
Like, the right to vote is being fought over again, just in a different way.
Right.
The same thing. It's the same argument. So, and I think that young people are maybe more tired now than maybe they were 50 years ago.
Well,
because there's an awareness that's sort of hitting the younger generation in particular.
Yeah, I think it's definitely too easy for even intelligent people to just think, oh, there's no problem, and it's worse because the media bubbles are bifurcated, right? And so the information they're getting is going to get backed up by other people that they know or whatever, so it's going to get social proofed before anyone actually decides to look at it. Same thing with Antifa, right? I mean, like, everyone just is saying, well, Antifa is part of the protest. There's no evidence of that at all, right? Like, it's like the second you go looking for it, all you can find is that there's white nationalists dressing up as Antifa.
Yeah, the FBI said they found no evidence that
right, like it's not a thing, and that's just indicative of everything else. I mean, like everything that happened with the tear gas and the rubber bullets, going after a peaceful protest at the White House. Trump right now is on Fox News saying none of that happened. Right? Like that, it's just revisionist history on top of media bubbles that are going to be reinforcing that. So like now, and honestly, like anybody watching me on Facebook, that like the airlock is on a hair trigger. And this is why, right? If people are in that information bubble, there is, to my mind and to the evidence of everything that I've seen, no redeeming them at all for me. Right? That it's because it's over. Like convincing somebody who will listen to that kind of propaganda, that will succumb to that kind of revisionist history, like I would have to sit down with that person one-on-one for a year to break them out of that, and I don't have the time. Right? And I don't feel good about that, and I want someone to explain to me something that I can do that will not drive me insane, that could be other than just quarantining them from my space, but I don't know what it is. Fucking pep talks, man. I am the best.
I guess what I think. No, and I hear you. I think I'm so angry about is this letter. This letter is to white Christian people. It's a warning. He actually warns them. If you don't do something now, violence will break out.
Right.
Hello?
Well,
and
yeah.
It continued because those same white Christians then go on 10 years later to politicize even more than they were in 1963 with Jerry Falwell and some of the other buffoons, and have created what we've got. They've actually created that they've perpetuated the problem even more, to the point where they've put 45 in office and declared him their political god because he's going to help bring, I don't know, the fucking rapture, which isn't going to happen. I mean, he warned them.
Yep.
And obviously we look back now. I mean, he mentions Elijah Muhammad, who obviously, in my opinion, Elijah Muhammad is definitely sort of the tribal leader of what was happening at the time. And Malcolm was somebody who moved on from that. I thought the Malcolm X documentary, for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, docuseries is excellent in kind of showcasing what really went on in that relationship. But that's the point, is it's a warning that is coming true. It's a prophetic warning that is coming true.
Yep.
So, Corey, on the thing about, how can I work to change their minds without going crazy? I would submit that maybe going crazy is what we are tasked with. That our sanity is less important than their bodies.
So,
and I'm no better at convincing them than you are.
That's the thing. Show me an example of that working, and I'll be interested. Until then, it's just conjecture. And like right now, especially after seeing the military takeover of Washington, that's a thing that's just happened, right? Like, it's a sentence I can say in English.
And against the law, by the way.
None of that means anything anymore. The only thing to me that I'm interested in is, are you going to help get this motherfucker out of office? And if you're not, and if you're even going to be mealy-mouthed or fucking navel gaze or like trying to say, oh, both sides, whatever, I'm going to cut you the fuck out of my life for good. Like, that's what I have, right? I need to find the helpers, and we need to get to work. Like, this whole like having an argument about it and convincing, and maybe, some of them are, I don't care anymore. It doesn't matter because there's no time. Right? This is 10 minutes before Hitler. We don't have a choice. Like,
if
we need to register
Obama
voters.
was allowed to run for a third term, he would not fix this problem. This is not. Yeah. Listen, the immediate house fire is this presidency. That is true. But all this presidency did was empower the hundreds of thousands, the millions of Americans that either A, think the problem was solved and they can look away from it. Look, I posted pictures of cops kneeling in Coral Gables, down where you live. I posted pictures of police officers taking a knee and marching with protesters in Camden, New Jersey, and in Flint, Michigan. Why? It made me feel better. That's the only thing it did. Right. And Ginny Rupert posted a meme the other day that said cops kneeling with protesters is like your abusive boyfriend buying you flowers after he punches you in the face. And I was uncomfortable with that. I was really uncomfortable with that. But, unless those individual law enforcement officer actions, those leadership actions are followed up with systemic change to the system that oppresses Black people more than it does anybody else, or people of color more than people of my racial makeup, then it is exactly that. It's a gesture. It's a simmer down. Don't make more trouble. I work in domestic violence counseling. Actually, this is a dynamic that I've seen a million times. Yeah.
To your point, Greg, a white pastor friend of mine, Stan Mitchell, he posted this week after having a conversation with a Black pastor friend of his. And the Black pastor used domestic abuse to explain the Black experience, essentially saying it's like when the abuser falls to their knees and grows a conscience for 5 minutes. Those aren't
till the cameras are off, till the court case is over. Yeah.
And basically, forgive me. And the abused or the oppressed person will say, okay, just wants to make nice for the sake of peace for the moment.
I just want peace.
And then does it again.
Yep.
And then does it again. And he essentially, and you guys may have seen me isolate it and post it, but the thing that got to me is he said, sometimes it feels like you're more interested in getting rid of your guilty feelings than you are healing the wound that you caused. And Stan, he said we had to stop after that moment and breathe for a minute because that was heavy. Like I had that's uncomfortable. But it's a truth. And I felt that one. I felt that one because I've been in domestically abusive relationships, and I have felt the frustration with the other person attempting to be like, well, don't you think I feel guilty? I'm so sorry, I won't do that again. Just the line, the gesture I've mentioned. And enough of that shit. Enough of that shit. Marching needs to happen. Strategy needs to happen. If a person is a bar or a cafe shop owner, could you open your space up for some truth and reconciliation conversations for your community to see what your actual community needs? That does need to happen too. there was actually a documentary, and I haven't gotten a chance to watch it yet, but I've been reading all about it, called Dreamland. But the whole documentary is based around the idea of doing this with the indigenous communities, where I think there's one in Maine in particular where they basically got them together. And what it did is they held space for the indigenous people to come forward and say, this is what you've done to us. This is what you've done to our children. And it was hard, but the community is beginning to like figure out how to navigate and grapple and wrestle with it and start making plans for what their community needs. There may be in one city, the disparities are nationwide, but one city might have a greater disparity around housing. Okay, so let's tackle housing first. Another community might have a disparity around small businesses. Let's deal with those first. Whatever it is, each community, this is going to have to come in on, there's national issues that need to be taken care of, and that would be the laws, the cops, the Justice Department, and so forth. But when it comes to the needs of the community, there needs to be consistent action. And I keep telling people, whatever you know how to do, whatever your thing is, your business, your life, your space, figure out how to use that, as King says, to be a creative extremist in this space, to actually contribute to forward movement, because that's what needs to happen. Right now, the protests are about getting the attention for the sake of arresting the cops. And that's what I think that I am observing in the protests right now. That's the purpose. Let's start there. So the start is police officers across the country, start looking at your cops and find where the accusations are and line them up. Come on.
Yep. Well,
That's
and part of me is starting to feel like and I wanted to ask you guys your feelings about the sort of combination of Malcolm X and MLK, because I'm starting to feel like they're sort of necessary components of the same machine. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I'm learned this time, and I think I'd heard about it before, but I didn't really internalize it, is the police unions, right? The police unions have so much power that they're constantly, getting these cops hired or rehired or getting them off any.
They pay money to train them
ramifications
in the constitutional argument that gets cops off. There's a specific Supreme Court case that they always use to defend police who have killed somebody. And the police unions finance seminar training for the lawyers of police agencies to be able to successfully argue that in court. There's a reason cops get off, and it's not that they haven't done anything wrong. It's that there is literally a constitutional mechanism decided by the Supreme Court that lets them get off.
Right. Well, obviously that needs to change. What I was focused on, you're right about that, obviously. But it feels like
police unions that are paying for that. That's
right.
That's
right.
Yeah.
But I think they're applying all kinds of different kinds of pressure that only like a freaking national and now international protest that is putting massive pressure on municipalities and states and the nation period are enough to crack that influence to the point where they will even bring charges, right? Otherwise, like, if you are not like burning streets down, the police unions will win, because the municipalities, even like like de Blasio, progressive mayor of New York, is like clearly not able to handle this in any way that stops the NYPD from running cars through crowds of people, right? And there's like 1,000 stories coming out of New York. There's Chris Hayes had the mayor of Chicago on. I can't remember her name. Black lady, clearly, is
it Lori Lightfoot?
Yes. Progressive and like came up sort of critical of over policing. And so he asked her about it, and you could tell like she was having to thread that needle in a way that was kind of uncomfortable to watch. So it's really, really clear that there is an amount of power that's been accrued there that needs to be broken before we have any chance of really dealing with this specific issue of police violence, because they're untouchable right now, and we've been okay with that because like, please make us feel safe, right?
But what is safety?
Yeah, well,
like,
I agree. Like, it's ridiculous.
Define safety. Like, what is safety at this point?
Right. I mean, well, really, safety for us and safety for our, African American neighbors and family. Right. It's completely different.
Was it Breonna? Was it the woman Breonna who they marched into her
Breonna
home?
Taylor. Yeah. No knock warrant in the wrong house and shot her dead. Right.
fucked
So
up.
that's been my, the Black Lives Matter, all lives matter ridiculous argument. That's been my point is, all houses matter, but the one that's on fire is the one that we need the firemen and the fire hoses to appear at and put it out. Right. And so we like safety important. Who's most in danger right now? People of color. Who's suffering the most under the authoritarian jackbooted bullshit of police agencies is black people. I live in Pasco County, Florida. I saw this number the other night in the Police Violence Project database that nationally 24% of people killed by police are African American. Okay. And they only make up 16% of the population nationally, which surprises some people. Right. So the scope with which African Americans are killed by police is much greater than their population. So I looked at the Pasco County number. In Pasco County, in my county in Florida, black people only make up 5% of our population, and they make up 20% of those who are killed by police. Now, it's not a huge number. It's two people in the last 6 years. 2 African Americans have been killed by Pasco County Sheriff's Office specifically, but it's still 20% of the total population of my county. So we're worse than the national average. Everybody here thinks, oh, our cops do a great job. Why? Because you're 95% of the population who isn't seeing this, right? And I also like to make the point about Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy both, that things got really bad for them when they started talking about poverty. Aside from race issues, when they started really digging into poverty, whether we're talking about Bobby Kennedy, farm workers and Hispanic minorities out west, or Dr. King's recognition that poverty was an underpinning problem for blacks nationwide, that's when the turmoil with white people got worse. They were both killed in that moment. They were both killed in that struggle, and pile one on the other. Pile the fact that most of the poor people in our country are African American, far out of percentage for their actual numbers, that they overwhelmingly have the poverty problem as well as the problem of race. So the racial component.
Yeah,
it's that much worse. It's that much worse. And if we solve the poverty problem in black communities, and we apply that nationally, guess what? Poor white people are going to be made better by that.
Well, and wasn't MLK basically saying like, no, we want to actually partner with, poor white people, right?
Yes.
Like it wasn't, and really this is
his trips to Appalachia are, part of what changed that.
Right. Like, and this is, I think, the Andrew Yang and the UBI, the freedom dividend, that kind of thing. It's basically like, listen, let's just solve for poverty because it's going to move the needle on these things. Right. And I always have this, like the moral and ethical argument of like, well, we should be, focusing resources where, there's been some racial disparity because there's some justice there, right? Like there's some social ills that have been perpetrated by this country that needs some balancing. Yeah. That's a fucking good story, but saving poverty, will actually change things, right? And that doesn't mean that we don't want to think about that stuff in the future, but like it's really, really clear that MLK was onto something, because that's huge. And now with the unrest now, the uprising now, 50% of black adults are out of work.
Right.
50%
this is a multi-layered thing. It's an absolute
100%.
multi-layered problem. So what has to happen then is across the communities is that you're going to have different groups who are going to take care of different things, right? You're going to have a lot of people who are going to go out and they're going to protest, and it's going to address things like, police brutality, arresting cops, creating law. Then you're going to probably have another group who's going to focus on the job disparity, and another group who's going to focus on how, Atlanta. Actually, this one of the things I loved about the Atlanta Occupy movement. Occupy movement was very complex for a lot of freaking people. But what was interesting was Atlanta eventually morphed into addressing housing, because they realized that the housing disparity in Atlanta was actually greater than anywhere else in the country, and that for them, that needed to be the priority at the time. So the movement sort of morphed into, I think, a few smaller organizations, but ultimately what became of it was opportunities to help, and I still follow some of those activists, but opportunities to help not only help people get people homes, but keep people from being evicted from their homes, because home evictions were a huge problem, where banks were profiting off of it. And so they made these sort of their priorities. And that's actually been very, very slow, of course, because there's still plenty of problems in Atlanta, but it was something that morphed into what the community needed. And I think that as we go forward, and some of these protests are going to continue for a while because there still needs to be an outcry, especially when the national leader is threatening to send in military against the law on civilian people. And as he's already showcased that he will do it on peaceful people, and doesn't give a flying fuck as long as he gets his few white Christians who will vote for him because he took a goddamn photo with a fucking Bible in his hand. And I have got such a problem with that. And if there's any Christian, any person who claims Christianity that is okay with that, you better start fucking evaluating your values, because that is not okay. It is everything you preach against in church. It is the very people that Jesus called vipers and snakes. And I'm not nice about it, and I don't care. And it's a place where I'm going to be vigilant and speak out. This is not okay. Like, this is just not okay. And I am proud to see the preachers who have come out, including the reverend of that church, come out and say, yeah, no, not okay.
You know what? It is you that has to have that conversation, because locally, when we were trying to organize Pride, and we still have a problem with groups of local ministers who show up and scream horrible, obscene things at children during Drag Queen Story Hour and other gay gatherings, including Pride. Someone asked me to go speak to. There's a large church here in town that one of the sub pastors of that church is one of the people that comes and screams obscenities at gay people and children during these events. And somebody said, "Why don't you go talk to him?" I said, "No, sir. You are a Christian reverend. You are an ordained minister. You need to go speak to that church. That's who needs to. They need to hear that from you. In the same way that the conversation with All Lives Matter people has to be on me, has to be on Corey, has to be on you, like, because we, Black people have been saying this to them for literally, checks watch 58 years, and they have not heard it. That there is a difference in the oppression level of people of color than on the rest of us.
And I hear you, and I agree with you. And that's the thing is it's, even though I don't attend the institution or necessarily buy into the Western interpretation of the faith, the elements of the faith, the stories of Jesus, the spirit, I believe in those deeply spiritual things. And I know that, you guys aren't necessarily spiritual folks, but that's the point. Like, I understand the spirit, and for me, there's references that he's making in that letter that I really do get, because they were part of my growing up. They were part of my raising. And I think that there's this line that comes out, well, you should say, he says that too, you should say it in a better way, you should say it in a different way. To be honest with you, when Jesus used the phrase vipers and snakes, it was like cursing. It was like cursing. So, for me to say, fucking get your act together, I really don't see it as any different, because we have to, sometimes there is a place for the harsh reality and the harsh truth.
Right.
And I'm not going to be afraid to say that. There was a pastor friend of mine, Steve Wines, who's up in Minneapolis, actually. And he wrote today, he said, for those of you who are speaking your truth maybe a little bit more blatantly than you had before, know that you're not alone. And that it's okay if you need to shut someone down, or that it's okay if you need to take down a comment, or if it's, it's okay to kind of own that certainty. And I think it was important for him to say that.
Yeah. Because
there are people that want to be able to say something, but there's so much of a stigma on whether or not you can be fierce about it or be labeled crazy about it. And the way that one of the ways that we can help our Black brothers and sisters is to go into our own communities and start educating our own. And to bring more allies in, because they're tired, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and during the last campaign season, I'm just trying to remember who it was that said this. Don't come talk to Black churches about how bad you feel about what white people are doing. Go to white churches and talk to those people about what's happening, right? And the whole time we're having this conversation, I want to point out that Brandy Goyette in the comments is laser focused on the one central issue that we could address, all of us, regardless of our political persuasion, regardless of our religious persuasion or non-religious persuasion or our skin color, is police brutality. Like mandating cameras, mandating
Yep.
police cameras, mandating that there are civilian review boards in the that monitor these police agencies, allowing police departments to investigate themselves, or even their state police commands to investigate them, has not worked. It has not worked, and I believe that there are state agencies that probably have the right motive and the right idea and take the right action, but a lot of them are made up of officers or command structure people from the cities that they're supposed to then go and enforce the law on. Further, state attorneys, district attorneys, prosecutors in criminal cases depend on police officers to testify to convict people of crimes. And one of the real problems that they face is if they go after cops, those cops will be less than willing to come and testify and convict people who have done truly heinous things. So they're trying to walk some sort of marshmallow tightrope with not offending the police, and that's a huge problem. Giving them some immunity from that would be remarkable, and finding a way to incentivize prosecutors to go after police officers, finding a fight that works. That's something that we have to do politically. That's something we have to do by who we elect to office. I've seen exactly one comment from our local county commission about what's happening. And her comment on Twitter, and I screen capped it, was, "Why aren't the Philly police protecting that Target store?" Right. That's how lost my community is. That's how lost my community is. That the one county commissioner that said anything about it was in defense of a Target store. And by the way, Target corporate issued a statement that says we can replace merchandise. We stand with with the members of the communities where we have our stores. This is wrong. Blah, blah, blah. But I think I know we're focused on these 4 cops, these specific 4 police officers. But I honestly think we need to be having a much bigger dialogue about police brutality across the board. And no one wants to go after our local sheriff and his deputies because they're protected by them. We're 95% of my county's population. And so when people, everything here is fine, from your perspective, that may be true. You don't live on the other side of the tracks in Dade City, Florida, where when the sun goes down, things can get ugly. The Dade City police chief, however, did release a statement, about how deplorable it is and how hard they're going to work to make sure that the African-American community in Dade City, which is our county seat, by the way, is well looked after and treated fairly, even if they protest. He's the only law enforcement head in my county who's issued any such statement. And there are 5 other police agencies here. Newport Richey Police haven't released a statement.
I do want to say, that while I think that there's a place for the frustration to be expressed, and there's a place for sort of the righteous anger to be expressed, there also it's twofold. There has to, Corey, you mentioned Malcolm and King, and interestingly enough, they were both players that created something that had to navigate and dance its way really together on some strange level to get any of the attention that they did, to accomplish even the small steps that they did.
Right.
And so while there is, I think, room for sort of the impassionate response, there's also has to be room. This is why I kind of keep going back to the truth and reconciliation conversations, to start somewhere. I listened to Rush Limbaugh today talk to Charlemagne the God and the Breakfast Club. And, there were some egos that got in the way, particularly Rush Limbaugh's egos. And there were some parts of the conversation too that I think were, worthy of listening to. I don't agree with half the shit that comes out of his mouth. I don't agree with 90% of it. But I think what was attempted in that conversation was just that, a conversation. Let's start something. And he actually asks at the end to do it again. And Charlemagne actually says to him, he says, look, I'm going to be honest with you. If you're willing to come and learn and hear more, fine. If you're just going to come on and deny our reality, then no, I don't want to do it. And that's fine. He was very blunt and honest with him. But I think what happened was the fact that Rush actually was the one who initiated the conversation in the first place. It's got to start somewhere. It doesn't even matter if the first one is imperfect and I'm glad I listened to it. I'm glad that they decided to get together and have a talk.
You did the same discomfort. I think it's really justified at police kneeling, because it might sort of placate us into not demanding and requiring that kind of thing. Rush Limbaugh has no credibility. It is firmly and solely a political stunt to try and get a tiny little fraction of a percentage of the black vote for Donald Trump. And like,
he's not going to get any of the black vote for Donald Trump. And that conversation was definitely evidence of that.
I hope so. I hope so. But Trump doesn't get 0% of it, right? And obviously he's like he said he's done more for black people than anyone since Lincoln. So that that's the kind of messaging that's going to be going out there. And to a higher extent than has been seen in the past, it worked, which makes no fucking sense. But that's where, again, maybe as a political animal, because I agree, having those kind of conversations is vital. Having them with Rush Limbaugh so that he can try and rehabilitate his image to any degree, that starts to get a little bit weird. Now, granted, I also follow Joe Walsh, and he's working overtime trying to rehabilitate his image. So, I guess, I would probably tell somebody else, hey, maybe leave the door open, but fuck, I want to fucking smash some people's skulls with the door.
Okay.
Yeah, but look, Charlemagne definitely took him to the mat. And I mean, look, sometimes Charlemagne has his own ego in mind. I mean, that his own name is an ego trip, right? But and it was funny because the woman, I forget the woman's name, but the woman who does the Breakfast Club, she was actually the one who kind of kept bringing him back. All right, guys, we get the male pissing contest over with, and let's come back to center.
Right.
And so of course, I appreciate her role in the matter, but I think what it's worth is, and I've told you guys before, one of my favorite movies right now is called The Best of Enemies, which came out in 2018 and has Sam Rockwell in it. And it was a true story that happened in the 1970s around school integration. And you had a black professor who came into Durham, North Carolina, who said, we're going to get people together to talk about this. And Sam Rockwell plays the guy that was the head of the KKK in the city. And then of course there was the female black activist who played his counterpart. And in the end, he leaves the KKK. And the conversations were really uncomfortable and awful and terrible. And there were still attacks when they were supposed to be having these meetings and all kinds of things. But what happened is the more they kept doing them, the more that the two of these leaders kept finding strange elements of humanity in the other person. And the one who needed to leave theirs left theirs. So there is power in doing it, even if the first one is a publicity stunt.
Yeah.
All right.
Fine,
Ash Gallagher.
Yeah.
No, you're
well, the thing for me about Rush is,
right.
he waited till too late.
Well, that's right. But at the same time,
I would feel better about his efforts to rehabilitate his image if he wasn't dying of cancer and feeling like he had.
I don't care about it.
You know what though? Here's the thing. Because I obviously agree with you. Because I just, I was suggesting we maybe hit him with the door as opposed to open it for him, which is not the most Zen thing I could probably say. But the what happens if, and again, say he's dying of cancer or whatever, and he's got the drunk uncle, not even Fox News wasn't harsh enough for him. He's got everything going against him as far as the bubble that he's created for himself. But if there's a 0.01% humanity that actually accidentally cracks that open in his specific case, and he takes 1 or 2% of that back to AM radio, then maybe that has a 5% effect on his audience before he dies. And that's significant. That's maybe thousands of people, which is interesting. I do want to get to there's a VP argument going on in the comments, and we can go back to talking whatever you guys want to talk about after this. But so I saw Kelly Smith, who is a fucking genius, who's actually coming on Friday to talk about Erderup, which is a housing technology thing. Greg, I didn't tell you about that, but that's happening. So she had a post yesterday where she was talking about Val Demings, And I want to, before I say anything else, if Biden picks Val Demings, it's going to be like she's a badass. Yay, right? But obviously, I've been advocating for Stacey Abrams for quite a while. So I wanted to check on some numbers. So let me just throw a couple numbers at you before going into what I think will be more of a sort of just a straight political game theory question. Stacey Abrams had 1.9 million people vote for her in Georgia, and she had that election stolen from her in what is still known as a deep red fucking state, right? She fought the enemy and basically won. Like they had to wreck democracy to stop this woman, right? And she, of course, was organizing, armies of Black women as activists, which is exactly what Democrats are going to need to do to win as much as we can, but also was reaching into the suburbs to create coalitions with white people in Georgia that wanted to create that kind of vision, and that it was extremely significant. Val Demings she won a primary, yay, but she won a primary in a district that went to Hillary Clinton by 25 or 26 points, and she's a cop. Now, can that work? Maybe, right? But Amy Klobuchar, who is not a horrible human being in any way, shape, or form, has been a very effective.
He's too fucking safe.
Well, here's the thing:
she's taking a beating this week.
Well, and here, it's a bit of a longer story, right? Like in the whole, hey, you gotta, get somebody from the Rust Belt, yada yada. I think that's kind of an old and tired argument, but whatever. It's an argument people were making, right? And she's not horrible. She's been extremely effective in the Senate, which is why I think we should keep her there. But even more so, she was the Attorney General, and literally had cases with some of these cops in Minnesota.
State attorney.
Sorry, go across her desk, and she let them go. So as a cop, she was part of that functionality and was literally part of the problem, right? And it's the same reason that Kamala Harris, who again, if she gets picked, not going to bother me in any way, shape, or form. She's badass, but has kind of a checkered past in California, right? With this issue, and now, right, as a prosecutor, and as Attorney General, if I'm not mistaken, in California,
right?
And so Val Demings has not organized a massive election. She won a congressional district primary, right? Which again, I could never do. So, all the more power to her. But it, to me, again, just looking at the straight math, the moment we're in requires, I think, or begs for maybe the ability to speak to the African American community. We're going to organize them. We're going to actually change this. So go get the organizer, not the prosecutor.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, I'm a strong Abrams advocate.
Yeah, well, I think we all are. I'm going to go back. First of all, I want to say how happy I am to see C.E. Smithwick in the comments here. Good morning, Casey. Can we talk about how to prevent these kinds of murders as they occur? Am I willing to knock the cop off the neck of another person and face being charged with assault on a police officer? Yeah, that's personally brave, but we've put them in such a protected bubble. We put police officers in such an idolized totalitarian sphere of existence that people are going to get shot to death for doing that. And the people that are going to get shot to death are the people most likely to be on the scene when it happens. And those people are also probably going to be minorities. And I love your bravery. What if we just made it so that just didn't happen anymore? But what if we just made people not homeless? It's the same thing.
I just want to say, Greg telling other people not to throw their bodies on if you had any fucking idea, how many times I have to listen to Greg talking about throwing his aged fucking ill body onto the machine. It's weird that somebody with your last name is suggesting this. And by weird, I mean not weird.
Not weird at all.
No.
I love you, kid.
Well, I mean, I even look at the video that we have of him killing Floyd, of him murdering Floyd. You can kind of tell that it's off center a little bit. There's almost like a hiddenness to it, and so it's terrifying. The whole situation is just fucking terrifying. And they should have body cams. They should have body cams that an alert should go off if they turn it off. I would suggest that
they should get immediately fined $100,000 and get fired if it gets turned off. Honestly, maybe what we should see, and this might be crazy, but I don't know if it is. It should be a third party that runs all of the tapes. This is a thing you could do, right? Your body cam, you plug it in, it goes to a third party server that is
So you're
owned
talking
by
about maybe
us.
like a cabinet level police oversight,
or like a state, and the prosecutors and the defendants in any however that works out get equal access to any tape automatically, right? Supervised, whatever, but like it's third party. Like what this is, having them run the video of that stuff. It's just another version of them policing themselves.
There has to be a creation of, I guess, a law or whatever you want to call it. I don't care, policy, something. The moment you show up to work or that you clock in, camera goes on. If you turn it off, there will be something that will register to whoever is running the security on it, whoever's running those cameras. You will be logged that you turn it off. You will be fined or whatever the consequence of it is. And any actions during that time could cause suspension. So you get suspended. And an investigation happens during that suspension to find out what the fuck you did while it was turned off.
Yep. Hey, yeah, Boxer Cat makes a good point that what's good enough for the cannabis industry is good enough for the police. They are never allowed to have their cameras off. Like they are fined and run out of business. They lose their license if they turn their cameras off at dispensaries where she works. Casey says people like us used to put it on the line to help black people vote, and they were murdered and burned alongside them. It would be great if nothing like this ever happened, but until we are at that point, ... I think maybe more of us should be willing to become the police cams until we have that system in place. We need to be, when we see people being arrested and treated, we need to be turning on our cameras and shooting video.
Yep, absolutely.
And publishing that video. And are we going to face backlash for that and possibly criminal charges? Yeah. The guy that filmed Eric Garner getting choked to death spent time in jail for filming that murder.
Which, by the way, wasn't against the law in the first place, but they found little loopholes to make it seem, to make sure that it's your time.
Yep. And that's a police agency punishing a person for telling the truth about a situation. Awful.
So white people, pull out your cell phones.
That's a start.
So Rosenstein is testifying before the Senate, and apparently Lindsey Graham is going to be running that hearing, and so I would imagine if you go back to watch it, be prepared to barf. But he also dyed his hair and combed it to look like Daddy Trump.
What?
Lindsey Graham is
go look at any pictures you can find from today of Lindsey Graham.
Is he being senator for the outrage today? I haven't watched any of that.
Well, that's honestly, people are calling like, man, I hope he comes with the passion of Kavanaugh, because there's nothing says passion like protecting a fucking sexual abuser.
What I want to know is what Trump has on him.
Graham, like Bill Barr too.
Was the one who came out was like, no, he's terrible. He shouldn't be the candidate.
Yeah.
Blah, 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 blah. Like, what's Trump on you that you fell in line?
Seriously, granted, we watched the Epstein thing a little bit ago on Netflix, which is pretty nuts. But
I hope there's enough smelling salts handy to keep Miss Lindsay conscious. I do declare.
Anyway.
All right, I'm feminizing a bit.
Even as we were doing it, I'm like, this is not something that Greg allows. That's
I know.
Anyway, which is fair.
I have a personal exemption for Lindsey Graham.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I mean, we all get one maybe or something.
I don't know.
Okay, it's terrible.
Yeah.
So the Epstein thing comes, and one of the things that Alex Acosta, who was the Secretary of Labor under Trump for 5 minutes before they realized he gave a sweetheart deal to a fucking pedophile.
Yeah,
that guy, and Dershowitz, who was one of the people defending Trump in the impeachment scandal, who literally said like, no, I get it,
but I didn't take off my underpants.
That's exactly
it. Did
I get a massage from an underage girl? Sure, but I didn't take my fucking underwear off. That guy deserves to get kicked in the balls anyways, like really hard by 100 women. Anyway, none of that's the point. The point is, Alex Costa was saying, like, there's no way I could have given him a sweetheart deal because everybody up to the attorney general needs to sign off on it. So, like, how could I possibly have done that on my own? Guess who the fucking attorney general of the United States was? Just take a guess. It's Bill Barr.
Oh. Yeah.
So
He's
do we
also
have?
the one that
And
decided
at
not
this
to.
point where I'm just like blank staring, nodding.
I was like, what else can you do? It's like,
He's also he stopped the case against Eric Garner's killers. He's the one that finally said the Department of Justice wasn't going to pursue it any further. And by the way, there's video of him ordering. There's video of him ordering the attack on protesters in front of the White House yesterday.
is there really?
Yes, there is.
I've seen reports that he did it, but I didn't know
there's video of him standing and pointing right out there. You know, it was Bill Barr.
And actually, Stephen Colbert played back the video during his speech, and you hear the pop.
Yeah.
Yep.
We stand with the protesters.
I'm a mix of all the emotions, right? All the emotions of grief. So anger, sadness, determined. There's a mix of things because it has to be. I think it is King's words. Let's all of this turn us into creative extremists.
Fact. Okay. Speaking of creative extremists, I'm wearing my brand new Dave Myers. I don't know if the light's going to get my Dave Myers Creature from the Black Lagoon in a Hawaiian shirt. I'm really excited about that. Thank you, Dave,
Which is
very
funny,
much.
Because it clearly was your shirt from before.
What do you mean?
That your shirt from before is the one that the creature is wearing right now.
It kind of is.
Oh, yeah, it is. It kind of is.
Yeah.
Nice.
So we're super happy with our Dave Myers shirts. You can find him on TeePublic under Dave Myers Illustrations. He has some pretty poignant political statements, like the steaming pile of shit with Trump's face on it and flies buzzing around it. That's a good one. And the angry snowflake, which you guys see me wear here on the show. So thank you, Dave, for your righteous talent and your creative your creative extremism. We love you. I'm not even sure if he's still here, but he was here a little earlier. So there. All right. So it's like 11:12. We've been on for an hour and a half.
I know that took a lot longer to read than I thought that it would.
That's
and there were
all
just some things I stumbled through. So in all my rawness, I apologize for any sort of stumbling. But
you done good. You done good.
Sorry.
Thanks.
All right. All right. So that's going to do it for us. You said Kelly Smith is joining us on Friday?
Yeah.
That's cool. I was actually going to try and get Dan Callahan to see if he could join us, because there was a unity meeting yesterday between community leaders and the sheriff's office to try and find common ground. And one of the people at that meeting tells me that there was a black minister that wore a Trump shirt to the unity meeting and praised President Trump, and it got really weird. And Dan was there as well. And Dan is my like, I'm finding myself at 56. Dan's in his I don't want to insult it. I think he's in his early 80s now. He served 3 tours in Vietnam. He's been an activist and a radical for decades in my community, supportive of American Indian movement. And he holds a peace protest every Friday morning at the corner of Ridge Road and US 19 in my community for the last 12 to 15 years. He and sometimes as few as 3 and as many as 100 people gather up on that corner in the name of peace. So if you're looking for a place to go and stand and hold a sign and support the idea of peace in our community, Dan Callahan's little Friday morning protest is a good way to start. But anyway, I'm hoping. I hear sirens going by Corey's house.
Yay!
Good times.
Apparently, there's independent contractors calling themselves federal officers working in both Washington and Miami.
Oh, that's awesome.
When pressed, they say they're part of the Department of Justice.
I would definitely love to hear how your guys' community meeting went.
I want to get with Dan and see if we can get him on. Yeah, let's see if we can get Dan on here. He's never been on the show. Remarkably,
because he really is amazing. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, he got he. So I see myself as I get older becoming more like Dan Callahan. Like, fucking arrest me. You know what I mean? Like, kind of. I see myself falling more and more into his kind of role as I get older. But he does more before 10 a.m. than I do in a week, even at his age. So we'll see how that goes. But anyway, so we're back on Friday with another #Coffee Show. Thank you, Ash, for staying up late and joining us from your corner of the world. We always appreciate and love when you come and share with us. You bring something good. When you get older, Brandy's like, when you get older, yeah. When I'm wait, what are you trying to say? Yeah. Anyway, so we love you guys very much. We'll see you back on Friday with another #Coffee Show. Please like and subscribe and share this video back to your social media platform. I would like everybody to get a chance to hear Ash reading the letter from Birmingham Jail. And we love you all very much. And Sasquatch is real.
That's what
Still there.